Greetings, everybody. Welcome, welcome, welcome to this bonus session of Lunar Alchemy. We're going to discuss the transit through gate 18, the archetype of the perceiver. And of course, Gene Key 18 takes us from the shadow of judgment to the city of perfection. And it's the gift of integrity. This one is very close to my heart, has my design north node, so I get the 1-2 punch of the 1817 all together. Super fun. Oh goodness, Steve, power shakes. I wish we could pour them straight into our core wound, but I tell you what, if you keep pouring them in your mouth, you might get there. So the perceiver. This is such an interesting title for this archetype. And I believe that most of humanity can relate to the shadow of this particular frequency of judgment, because it's so prevalent in our relationships and particularly in our thought patterns. If there's a person who doesn't have judgment operating in their mind in a powerful way, I've never met one. And in fact, when we read about Gene Key 18, it's kind of revealed that the whole idea of being non-judgmental doesn't really make any sense, because the whole function of the mind is to create judgment. I need to get out more. I mean, if you think I'm going to run across some people who are actually non-judgmental, I just don't think they exist. And that's not a bad thing. And that's part of why I'm excited about exploring this particular gene key, because there's a huge amount of baggage around this concept of judgment. But in fact, without judgment, there's no such thing as integrity either. So if you've got a non-judgmental person, you've not got a person, because there's no integrity to their form. And you can't have a person without integrity on some level. So kind of excited about where we might figure out to go with this one. And, I sort of thought that I might start off. I think I actually even did this last year, where I was like, I have a judgment to share, Bella. But I actually just want to ask a question, because I think the key about judgment is holding it lightly rather than attaching to it or trying to eliminate it. And so I'm going to hold on to my judgment lightly and ask the question, why is this archetype the perceiver, when everything I get from this gene key is about improvement?
That's a good question. And I feel like it's a very simple answer, and maybe we can explore deeper, because without perception of what needs to be improved, how could you ever improve? So that perception comes first before there can be an improvement.
I like that. So in the I Ching, this is mountain over wind. So the gentle beneath the wind. And the name, the Chinese character of Ku, I'm not sure that I'm pronouncing that properly, but it's Ku when it's translated to English. It represents a bowl with worms breeding inside of it. And the hexagram, therefore, is named work on what has been spoiled. And it implies that not only has there been something which is spoiled inherently, but also that the responsibility of that spoiling lies with the person who's kind of like managing that environment. And so that's where the work comes from. It's not just what has been spoiled, it's work on what has been spoiled. And it strikes me that this idea of improvement, this urge that comes inside of us to improve the world around us, or to perceive the world in terms of what it is or how it could be, is where all of this energy kind of starts to come from. And I'm curious to hear more about your perspective on, okay, so is it then the perception that determines the need for improvement? Or is it that there is an actual need for improvement that the perceiver witnesses? Like, what are the layers of this archetype, and how are they functioning in us at different levels?
Yeah, great question again. So here we are in the splenic center, and the splenic center is not mental. So it's true that this gene key is coding for the IQ in the golden path, that Richard Rudd is using it when he's speaking about the function of our mind or the development of our mind. Really, in the mechanics of human design, where it's in the spleen, and the spleen has that instinctive response or perception of something that doesn't work, something that is not, it's not good for our well-being, or something that could kill us, if we want to go back to really the reptilian response. It's connected to the root as well, so it definitely has to do with survival in that sense, and perception of what doesn't work. When we look at the circuitry, this is logical circuitry. So it's part of evolution, logical circuitry. And I usually like to speak about circuitry as what the archetypes in that circuitry care about. The archetypes in the logical circuitry care about the future. They care about finding that better pattern that can take us into the future. And I believe that when we speak just within the human race, but we could speak from the monkeys to the human, that the same patterns that function for the monkeys are not going to function for the humans. And within the human race, as we are evolving, there are patterns that are going to evolve, patterns that are better when it comes to taking us into the future, the collective into the future. So it's in the process of evolution that the 18 can actually even stand up against authority of the last generation, what was the pattern, the prevailing pattern, and say, actually now as we're evolving, this is the pattern. And that is part of that whole logical circuitry, where we are making sense of the patterns, and we're walking into future with a pattern that's even more logically beneficial, you could say.
So that makes me think of this whole gift frequency of integrity. And I think of it about integrity from the standpoint of an engineer, which is actually brought up in the gene key discussion in the book as well, where when you build a bridge, the integrity of the structure has to be capable of supporting a certain amount of weight, because you actually cannot build a structure that is impervious to a certain amount of weight. You know, like when we build a skyscraper that's very, very tall, the engineers have to build in the ability for that building to sway in the wind. I assume that any of the skyscrapers in Miami are, they're waving around right now. Hopefully their integrity is intact. And a lot of times I feel as if our experience of integrity, it's almost like it comes to the forefront when it's challenged by a contrast. And at other times, if that contrast isn't strong enough, it's almost as if that awareness of integrity kind of sort of dissipates, at least in terms of the way human beings interact with each other. And when I'm thinking about the perceiver, and we're talking about, oh, well, we can look at, and this is one of the things from the I Ching too, is to look at what are the patterns that have been set in motion from the past that are no longer fitting to allow us to move into the future. And perceiving that, seeing that, being able to witness the patterns that are present and look ahead and say, hey guys, like these patterns, that these traditions that we've been following aren't gonna take us to where we all say we want to get to. And when integrity comes in, is this only a function of when there's a hurricane swirling around outside? Is it only a function when the traditions are outdated, that they'll no longer carry us to the future we desire? How do we relate with this idea in terms of what we can perceive, what we can be aware of, and then how do we express into the world as a result of that interaction?
I feel that this process happens all the time in the big and in the small, and in the shadow frequency, that's really where the 18 can become, together with that 58 especially, you can just sound like this constant dissatisfaction, or this constant saying this is not good enough, and it becomes exhausting. And I feel that if we bring in here, for example, the elements, I feel that it's so interesting to even read: maintain a gentle mind and a strong back, restraining words until clarity is needed. And somehow that's what I feel that the most powerful recognitions of things from the 18 and where it can really be heard is when it doesn't just like blurb, like it just doesn't come out in a way where people aren't ready to hear, or in a situation where, this is a projected channel. It's between the root and the spleen. So it needs to be the right timing so that it can express itself. And if we wait, many of these little things that we feel could be done better, it actually doesn't matter. Like we have spoken about this before in other calls about like, oh, when the shoes are not in the closet, when the shoes are on the floor, it's just annoying because it would be so easy. It would be a better pattern to come in through the door and put the shoes in the closet, and then there are no shoes on the floor. And, but there's also something with that. Is that going to take us to a better future just because the shoes are in the closet? Maybe not. So I feel that here with, that maintain a gentle mind, maybe in the culture where the other person is from, the shoes are not even a thing. They are all on the floor. Like nobody cares about the shoes. And in Sweden, people care about the shoes and they're not supposed to be in the house. So can I have a gentle mind around that? And can I be in integrity still? Or am I like, oh, for me, if it's something else, maybe it even feels like it's crossing my boundaries to have those shoes for some reasons, or, something else. So the strong back is still speaking about what you're saying with skyscrapers in Miami, still about that integrity. And, I even think here when we say restraining words and the clarity is needed, but and that sounds like we're just waiting, the clarity is needed from the outside. But I even feel like it has to do with the inner process, that sometimes if we just pause with it, that's actually when clarity comes. If we don't have to use all our energy to complain about everything that we don't like, that's when something more true, like true clarity, can come through. And I just to kind of we can go into the braid at some point, but integrity is restrained intuition. This goes with it too. Like the restraining, like my intuition is that these shoes should not be on the floor. They should be in the closet. But if I can, and it's kind of like the first thing that the wind is blowing at me when I go into that house is the intuition about this is wrong. But you know, that's also just going with the wind. It's like following the wind. What if I can be more in balance? That's where I find integrity, where I don't have to be swayed just by those splenic reactions all the time that the 18 can come with. So thank you.
Yeah, I feel like what you're bringing up here, it really brings this particular contemplation into the realm of human design. And what does it mean to function from the spleen, whether it's defined or undefined? And when this comes through, you know, obviously every gene key has a reactive nature that's a part of the possibility of experience. And that sort of not intuitiveness, but the instinctual activity that happens that comes from there. You know, when there's a moment where there's shoes on the floor or whatever, and we can kind of, our spleen gets activated. And as we know, that spleen is kind of like the center for all things fear induced. And when we look at the human biology compared to the human psychology, the spleen functions as a survival mechanism. But the spleen still functions when there's shoes left out of the closet for whatever reason, because we haven't quite yet got to that level of frequency where we can just completely shift the whole system into a higher zone of frequency. Somehow our spleen is still functioning to say like, there's shoes outside the closet, we're not going to survive.
And see that word, John, alarm. I mean, that's exactly what you're speaking to. It's an alarm that goes off, the shoes on the floor.
I wasn't even looking at that. That's hilarious. Yeah, so it's like when we look at that possibility for restraint and to allow clarity to come in, I mean, it's such an unusual thing because we still live in a world where from time to time, even though it's fairly rare, human beings still encounter situations where that instinctual activity of the spleen is so incredibly necessary. But for most human beings, it comes in very, very rarely, you know? And obviously there are a few professions in the world where it comes a lot more frequently. But even in those professions, we can see that there are missteps that are taken. You know, when we look at law enforcement, they must rely on the movements of the spleen and their instincts. And yet, sometimes that relates in totally innocent people who have nothing to do with anything that the law enforcement is involved in getting killed. And so it's like, man, how do we thankfully, most of us aren't in situations like that, you know, and don't have to handle that degree of stress. Interesting in that braid, the stress of unease. So it's like when we begin to receive these signals from within our body system, how do we process those signals in a way that allows for clarity to come in? How can we do it in a way that actually supports our integrity? Because at the end of the day, that's the reason that judgment exists. Not because we need to run around saying, oh, you're fat, you're ugly, you're mean, you're, you know, all of these awful things that we say to others and to ourselves. But judgment exists so that we can understand the integrity of our being in relationship to the reality that's being created. Is this reality serving the path for my future or not? And how can my integrity remain intact if I don't move into a manifestation zone. It's so interesting that this one has, it just connects to the root, and there's no like direct connection up to the throat. So how do we handle that? How do we do it?
There is something here that makes me think about repairing, and a little bit different than what I was saying about evolution before, because it sounds like, yeah, as we evolve, there's a better pattern. But as I'm thinking about the 18, for example, in the Venus, and how we say that this is about children and parents when we are in the coding of matter, which is actually educating that matter to become human beings that function in the world, right? It feels that often the way we learn as humans is that something has to go wrong so that we can repair it. And when I'm taking back to times where we didn't have a new toy every time a toy broke, but maybe you had this kind of little car or something and it didn't function, and then you had to take it apart to see what didn't work and put it together. And I feel somehow in the consumerism that's going on, a lot of kids, something breaks and they get a new toy. But there's definitely something when we have to repair, which would be the same thing that it work on what's been spoiled, that I can see. It's a kind of responsibility in this gene key that comes to mind, which is not only, again, about looking towards the future, but it takes us into as well learning to repair and then moving forward in a way that is in more integrity than the way we first did it.
Yeah, somehow, and I'm not exactly sure why this happened for me. Obviously, when you bring up, I mean, this gene key, and we haven't talked a lot about it, but this gene key has so much to do with parenting. And one of the periods of parenting that it seems that is almost a universal challenge for parents to move through successfully. And that's guiding teenagers into adulthood. And for some reason, while you were bringing up that idea, I just couldn't stop thinking about how those who manifest the acidic frequency through this particular gene key can't stop themselves from being in service, from doing things that fundamentally improve the experience of the world. And it's like, it's such an interesting, to me, that's such an interesting connection, because when I think about the archetypical teenager, they're almost as far away as we can judge a person to be from the acidic frequencies. They're judgmental, they're opinionated, they're rebellious, it's like all of the shadow frequencies wrapped into a ball and then put in kind of a delicate package, and which is sometimes explosive in nature as well. But there's a certain delicateness to a teenager. And it makes me think that somehow there's a leap between judgment and the city because of that delicateness, because of how kind of, like, if you've ever really spent some time around some teenagers when you've become an adult, you realize that in certain circumstances, in certain environments, with the right type of encouragement, with the right type of attention, a teenager who is generally a ball of shadow frequencies and just generally an unpleasant human being suddenly becomes this bright, like open, excited and enthusiastic expression of divinity. And it's kind of like this, whoa, holy smokes, this human is amazing. And I just wonder if it isn't really brought up in here, but I wonder about that movement of evolution through our system, from the spleen to the root, and thinking of the whole ball of shadows and gifts and cities all in one kind of container. Like maybe our judgmentalism, that our judgment of our own judgment, even when it gets layered upon layered, maybe it's not such an awful thing. And maybe we just need an environment with the right type of encouragement and the right type of attention. And I don't know how we can create that on a collective level. I feel like it's happening in groups, like groups like the inner circle and the things that you've been involved in creating, Bella. It's like there's this opportunity for that to kind of blossom. But I wonder if there's ways that we can take those special groups and bring it into the rest of our experience, so that when we come in contact with somebody who doesn't know about gene keys or human design or anything, how do we give them that attention? How do we receive that attention from them?
I'm exploring as you're speaking, because we are in the transits of the coding ring of matter, and those are the gene keys that are coding every sphere in the Venus sequence, or the spheres that are the embodiment triangles, so SQ, EQ, and IQ, and then the 57 is the core. So 57 is the core, 46 is coding for the SQ, 48 I believe is coding for the EQ, and the 18 is coding for the IQ. And I work a lot with the SQ in the sense of reparenting the inner child, because similarly to how you speak about teenagers, what seems to be very important of how we can feel safe in our body. And I know that on another call today, Kelly was mentioning the emotional safety, the safety in the body, in order to be able to grow and experience and live and function, right? So I speak a lot about the SQ and looking at the line and a little bit the gene key, but more than anything, the line, to see what did a child need? How could we support that child? And for me, for example, I have a fourth line, and I know that kinship, community, trust, and feeling connection with other was extremely important and nurturing for me. So I'm wondering if we can just simply take the line of the sphere, and we would do the same thing in the EQ, saying what's the line there, and then we see again what that child between 7 and 14 needed. And what if we go to the IQ, that line here, if we look at the sphere, this is personality Venus. In astrology, Venus is what you value. It has to do with what you love, what you value. And as you are starting to develop your way of your perspective of the world, if we can give that teenager what they value through their blueprint, I feel that would be a support for them to be in integrity, because we're giving them like those building blocks that they can actually build something in integrity with. And I'm thinking then back to me, I have the 25.6. It's an Aries gate, and definitely I feel like if I thread everything what that 25.6 is about together with Aries, I think there is something about independence. Like I would value as a teenager to have responsibility, but freedom under responsibility, like that independence of Aries. I do believe that for me, innocence in all people, like that universal quality of the 25 that is pure in that sense, is something that I value a lot. And if I could see adults that had that quality of universal love and of innocence, I would believe in the world, and I would grow up in more integrity. And then going to the line, which was what I mentioned, definitely the 6th line, the objective view. If you could give me a way of looking at the world beyond like how we can look at the small things one at one, if you could give me the big picture and have me see that in a perspective that isn't judging, that is visionary, I feel like that would be the best thing to give me as a teenager, to grow up to be that divine adult or divine being. So there is something really to look at in that Venus activation, how we can support teenagers, possibly. I mean, that's an inquiry that I have. What's yours? Yours is the first line, right? What's your IQ?
Yeah, 57 in the IQ. Yeah, which is interesting because that's also in the ring of matter.
So do you feel that you had adults that were either examples of that 57.1, or in one way or another, showing you what that is like. I mean, depth, even speaking of the first line, who showed you depth, what it is to have that contemplative mind and that depth, because you have that, but how was that shown to you, role model to you, given to you in your teenage years?
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful question for everyone with whatever the particular gene key is. Me having 57 is unease, intuition, and clarity. And I decided during my teenage years that I was going to be a jazz musician. I was immediately just idolized all of these artists who rely 100% on their intuition. And I just centered all of my development throughout all of my teenage. I decided at age 14, I was going to Manhattan School of Music. That was what I was going to do. And, I didn't know if I could get in there or not, but I feel like I was extraordinarily lucky to have so many opportunities to explore that process in a very supported manner. And it was my perception, interesting, speaking of the perceiver, that most of the other people who I would consider my peers, the other teenagers, although we lived in kind of a, I guess, more or less privileged upbringing, not because we had lots of money or anything, because we certainly didn't. But what I mean is we had good schools. We had very, very low rates of crime, very low rates of danger in our community. We had access to cultural expression and these types of things. But even within that environment, a lot of the teenagers that I knew, I perceived as not receiving the support that they actually needed to be themselves. My perception was that most teenagers were being a person that wasn't really them in order to survive the situations that they were subjected to. And whether that was, being rebellious or being an achiever in some way, or whatever those archetypes were that they chose to get through it. It's been really interesting for me to witness all of those peers kind of become the adults that they are, and notice which of my peers seem to have become their own individual person, and which ones of them kind of became another version of their own parents, without ever really moving through that kind of process of integrating, I guess, what we would call the Venus sequence from a more, maybe even an intuitive way on some level. It's like just jumping from archetype to archetype, playing out these karmic patterns. But I have to also say that while you were bringing that up, Bella, what I was thinking of is that I've never felt a stronger connection from one of our discussions about the role that we play as a part of the collective. That somehow we're going through our lives kind of like bumbling around with our judgments and our opinions and our mistakes and falling down the stairs and whatever it is that we're up to, the experiences that we had as a teenager, whether they were supported or unsupported, or how we've been able to deal with that. Somehow all of these experiences are serving the collective in this massive way. And it's like each one of us as an individual has just one little part. And that one little part is absolutely perfect. Which kind of blows my mind to find that connection in terms of this discussion and where we've gone. So are you feeling braid, Bella? Or I can talk about energetics, because that's available too, or something else.
No, I feel open to hearing you, or to anything. Yeah, I feel content.
Well, I wonder if you would bring up the braid again anyways, because I just love the picture so much, because it just really gives us an idea of what's happening in the element. And I found this one a little bit, from the I Ching perspective, challenging to understand, because the description is like, when wind blows on the mountain, it reflects back and kind of ruins the vegetation. And I'm like, what? What are we talking about here? And then I started feeling into the braid of stress and unease. And what is the vibration of that? And when I look at the mountain, that's kind of like the position of our body when we come into a state of non-flexibility, when our karmic pathway gets hardened and we're not able to be in a state of openness or of freedom or whatever. We kind of turn into it. We kind of turn into this mountain on the earth, which is inertia. And strangely, the 9 in the I Ching writing of this particular hexagram, the 9 is brought up all over the place. It talks about inertia and all this other stuff. But I started thinking about the body, and what does stress feel like in the body? And I'm open to hearing other perceptions of this. You know, I'd be curious, Bella, if you have a way of putting it. But what I came down to is that stress and unease inside the body, it feels like this vibration that's happening within our body system. And it's a feeling that needs a release. And what I figured is that release, often our mind steps in and says, oh my gosh, we might not survive this vibration if we don't release this energy. And then the mind steps in and says, we're going to release this energy through the pathway of judgment. We're going to express something about the outer situation that is capable of being made less than, of being devalued, in order to release this inner stress, this inner unease. And yeah, Bella, I'd be curious to hear what you have to say about that, and if you feel like taking it up.
I guess I'm gonna do a left turn. I got super curious about what it would be when we changed the braid around. So we were saying that we had wind, or mountain over wind, and when you were saying that about the I Ching, I got super curious what would happen if we, instead of having unease and stress, if we change them. So maybe let's go. I want to do that. I mean, I don't know what's gonna happen, but
go ahead. I did want to mention, there was a comment made that stress is not unease, and I wasn't attempting to.
So let's make
they're equal.
Exactly. So make
they're functioning together within this particular vibration.
So let's go back. Exactly. So here we see that exactly what you were saying, John. They're separate. So we see that we have mountain and we have wind, and we can say wind over wind. that's the 57. And here we have the keywords for the 57. Then when we have mountain over mountain, that's the 52, which is stress, restraint, and stillness. So looking at the 18, which is mountain over wind, it's the same thing as saying the 52 over the 57. And that's what becomes the braid. And judgment is stressful unease. And yeah, I don't know if I ever thought about it, that is something that needs release, but that would make a lot of sense, which is also why the quick fix of drinking something or going out and distract yourself with something, it doesn't work, because it's just for a moment to change the focus to something else. It's not releasing that energy that's there and wants a way out. So it's even going to aggravate it, because instead in a way of addressing that, you're going somewhere else, so that the buildup is probably even worse. And then next time you need something even more loud in order to not feel it. So I love that. And I appreciate that way of seeing it. So here, I just feel that I wanted to look at these, what happens when we have mountain over wind. So judgment is stressful unease. Integrity is restrained intuition. Perfection is stillness with clarity. So that's the frequency band. And then I got really curious as you were speaking over what happens when we change it around. I'm sorry, I'm all about synthesizing and weaving. So here suddenly we are the opposite. We have here, actually, this is the 53. Is this 53? Yeah, this is the 53rd jinky, I believe. Where did it go? Yeah, this is the 53. So here suddenly we have wind over mountain. So exactly the same hexagrams, but in opposite orders. And here we're then speaking about immaturity, expansion, and superabundance. So look, especially here in the when we were looking at the other about the stressful unease, immaturity is uneasy stress. Like I feel like a knot in my brain. And then intuitive restraint. I mean, it's different to say restrained intuition, because that is integrity. But when we say intuitive restraint, that's expansion, right? Like there is something here, it becomes maybe mental. But then when we say, instead of stillness of clarity, we say clarity of stillness, that is abundance or superabundance. There is something here just to even think about. Have you ever thought about the 18 in relationship with the 53? Because that's not the programming partner, that's not the harmonic gate. There is something where usually we don't think about it in terms of the element, but the 53 has something in common with the 18, because they are the same element, just inverse.
That's awesome. So when we look at these elements, I think it was interesting that in the whole call today, Bella, that you worked with the breath and the body, because what I was led to is that the restraint of intuition, it happens through the breath. When the spleen kind of has that moment and we take a breath, then we have an opportunity to give our body what it needs to know that survival in this moment is available, that what may be being presented to us isn't the shoes outside of the closet. We might see it and we go, and then the body freaks out because it's hardened into this mountain, and there's actually this vibration, a need for releasing of breath and taking in more and allowing it to be a cycle. And so I just found in my contemplation of this particular energy that there was a huge amount of wisdom in what you shared today, just and even though it wasn't particularly related to the 18 at all, I was struck by how connected it appears to be in terms of how do we work with this energy? How do I experience integrity in my body? The breath restrains the intuition and allows that intuition to come into a state of clarity to some extent, some maybe higher frequency form of it. So that was really what I wanted to share about the energetics, is that when we're experiencing a challenge to our integrity, or we're experiencing a movement in the direction of judgment, or we're receiving judgment from others, the breath is our friend, because we can remember that the judgments that are placed onto us aren't actually threatening our survival, not anymore. At one point in our tribal history, it could have been a threat to our survival, but most of the time, in most circumstances, that isn't the case anymore.
Thank you, John. And I want to just make this clear through showing again, it's just like I feel that clarity, maybe because we are close to the 57 and it's part of this. So really, you're speaking about the spleen, and we have all these splenic gates. It's color coded. So everything that is yellow here, you can see it's all splenic gates. I know that somebody who took the human design system, Jeremy Wilson is his name. He took the human design system and he made it normal language. So he says, for example, gut response for splenic authority. And when it comes to the spleen, he speaks about the spleen as breath. And when you have a defined spleen, your breath is impacting the world. And when you have an undefined spleen, it's like you're breathing the world and the fear of the world. And I definitely feel that connects to what you're saying. And also the fact, so I was showing you wanted to show here the elements, and we are in the elements of wind, and kind of knowing that what you're saying, the judgment, like whatever comes with the wind, what do we do with that? Well, the 57, for example, it grounds us in our intuition, in our clarity of what's there, and the discernment of the 18, the 48 that feels deep into the body for the truth, the 32 that knows what's worth preserving. Maybe some new principle is coming flying with the wind, but that's maybe not what we want to be guardians for. So there is definitely in this part of the wheel, and in this element, we can see the breath, the intuition, what these hexagrams or archetypes are about. And also, if we look astrologically, Libra, it is to be able to weigh and to find that equanimity and find that integrity with everything that comes with the wind. And I feel that is so important. And yeah, there might be some alarm, but when we can tap deeper into intuition, deeper into clarity, that's really when we know how to walk in the world with integrity, what to be guardians for, and how, that feels important to just make even more visually clear.
Beautiful. Yeah, it's so interesting to really study the wheel and see how the elements flow from one into the other, from one space of the body into the next. Such a beautiful study. So I want to thank everyone for joining us for this discussion. Since we had a kind of an opportunity to pop in, the transit of the 18 will, I believe, conclude on Sunday, or maybe it's early on Monday, depending on where we are. But we will be rejoining back on Monday for our next discussion. And we'll look forward to meeting any of you who are available to join us for our discussion. And now we'll move to our elemental transmission. We're going to be working with, I didn't expect this. I was really like thinking we were going to do only 4 elements, Bella, all the way through, but ether just wouldn't stop. It was like, no, we have to have all three. So earth, air, and ether came in as elements, ether, of course, being a somewhat subtler element than the other four. So that's what we're going to be looking at today. So I'm sending loving presence to your hearts from my heart. Thank you for joining us, for being very spirited in our discussion in the chat. It's really, really, it really is a fantastic interaction that is happening. I know that we present from this webinar format, and that all of you aren't present on camera in our discussion. And I'll blame that on my learning process as a 6'2". And you know, but I want to thank you for being present with us and for contributing to the discussion. And I'll look forward to seeing you again in our next discussion. And thank you, Bella, for all of the structural wisdom and everything that you brought today, because I feel like it was all really, really important for the integrity of our discussion.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
All right, we'll see you next time.